London learned of a woman's disgrace long before it learned her name. The whispers began beneath chandeliers and followed the rustle of silk, passing from gloved hand to gloved hand with the ease of practiced cruelty. She stood at the edge of a crowded ballroom, young, composed, and exquisitely out of place, while faces turned with polite interest that sharpened into judgment. A match once praised for its promise was now spoken of as an error quietly corrected, and the correction, everyone agreed, must be borne by her. She had entered society as the Duke's wife, with a humility that disarmed some and defended others. Her lineage was respectable yet unremarkable, her fortune modest, her manners careful rather than dazzling. He, by contrast, carried centuries upon his shoulders, titles recited like scripture, lands measured in horizons, obligations heavier than affection. When they married, the city applauded the spectacle and waited for proof. Proof did not arrive in the form London preferred. What grew between them was private, earnest, and therefore suspect. At the far end of the room, the Duke observed the same scene with a restraint honed since boyhood. His posture was impeccable, his expression schooled into calm, yet the muscles of his jaw tightened with each laugh that followed her passing. He heard the murmurs as clearly as if they were spoken to him, felt them land upon his name, his estate, his future. The crown's expectations were not voiced aloud, but they were present all the same, heavy as the portraits that watched him from ancestral walls. The evening ended not with a scandal, but with a silence that proved more devastating. Invitations failed to arrive. Doors opened with a fraction less warmth. A lady of influence offered sympathy wrapped in advice, suggesting that dignity might yet be preserved if matters were resolved discreetly. By morning, the solution had taken shape in careful phrases and legal courtesies. A separation, quiet and civilized, would spare everyone the spectacle of open conflict. It would also spare the Duke the charge of sentimentality, which society judged more harshly than cruelty. They met in a small drawing room the following afternoon, sunlight muted by heavy curtains. Papers lay upon a table polished to a merciless shine. She listened as terms were explained with kindness that felt rehearsed, and she answered with a steadiness that surprised even her. When the Duke spoke, he chose words that honored duty and avoided truth. He did not say that he feared losing her. He said only that circumstances required sacrifice. She inclined her head, accepting the language of necessity, and in doing so saved them both from humiliation. Her departure from their London house occurred before dawn. The street was damp with recent rain, the city holding its breath. A single trunk was lifted into a carriage, its contents reduced to essentials and memories. As the horses shifted, the Duke pressed into her hand a small volume bound in worn leather, a book she had once admired for its marginal notes. It was offered as provision, not confession, and she received it as such, though the weight of it lingered long after the carriage rolled away. London, relieved of the inconvenience of compassion, returned to its entertainments. The Duke resumed his obligations, attending councils and dinners with the ease expected of him, yet his room seemed larger and colder. He read the book's companion volume alone by firelight, tracing passages he knew she would have loved, and wondered when affection had become a liability. He told himself that order had been restored. He did not examine the cost. She traveled north and then east, toward a market town whose name promised nothing beyond anonymity. There, life arranged itself around bells, bread ovens, and the honest clamor of trade. She took lodgings with windows that faced a narrow street, where vendors called their wares and children ran with red faces through the cold. Each morning demanded attention, and in attending to it she discovered a steadiness that had never been tested in salons. Letters did not pass between them. This, too, was considered proper. The world believed the matter concluded, and she allowed it to believe so. Yet as weeks turned and her body changed in ways she could not ignore, she learned that the past was not finished with her. The knowledge arrived quietly, without drama, and settled into her like a vow. She placed a hand over her heart and chose, once again, dignity over despair. The Duke, months later, would stand among crowds and feel an inexplicable pull toward the ordinary, as if some essential truth had taken shelter beyond his reach. He did not yet know what he had lost, only that the silence he had accepted was not empty at all, but waiting. Winter approached with a decorum that suited the town, and she learned its rhythms by necessity. She purchased wool with care, exchanged greetings that asked nothing more than civility, and allowed her days to be shaped by purpose rather than speculation. At night, she read from the Duke's book, pausing at the margins where another hand had once lingered, and felt the ache of a life interrupted sharpen into resolve. If society had dismissed her, she would answer with composure. In London, preparations were made for journeys that promised distraction. The Duke accepted them readily, telling himself that movement might quiet the unease that had begun to trouble his sleep. He chose to travel without ceremony, exchanging livery for plain cloth, titles for anonymity, and set his course through the very roads that fed the kingdom. He did not plan to seek her, nor did he plan to avoid the places where ordinary lives unfolded. He planned nothing at all. When the first frost brightened the mornings, the market filled with breath and bells, and she stepped into the crowd with measured grace, carrying within her a future the world had not yet named, and destiny stirred quietly. Time moved differently in the market town, measured not by seasons announced in drawing rooms, but by the turning of carts and the changing calls of vendors. She learned to read the morning by sound alone, the clatter of shutters, the bell of the baker, the low voices bargaining over apples. Her presence no longer drew notice, and in that anonymity she found a steadiness that London had never allowed her to practice. Her condition became visible with the honesty of the months, and she met it without apology. She altered her gowns with careful hands, chose darker wools, and walked with a composure that discouraged questions. Those who noticed offered courtesy rather than curiosity, for the town valued restraint as much as survival. She paid her accounts promptly, greeted neighbors by name, and earned the quiet respect that grows from constancy. In the evening she sat by the narrow window, watching lamps bloom along the street like small, domestic stars. She read, she wrote letters she never sent, and she spoke softly to the life that stirred within her, promising safety rather than grandeur. Memory visited, but it no longer ruled. She refused bitterness, not from forgiveness, but from resolve. Whatever the world had decided, she would not be diminished by it. Far away, the Duke endured a year that felt both crowded and empty. Parliament demanded his attention, estates required inspection, and alliances were rehearsed in rooms rich with history. He performed each obligation with precision, yet found no satisfaction in their completion. His nights were restless, punctured by images he could not place, a street he did not know, a voice he could not hear. He traveled to avoid those nights, exchanging familiar corridors for the uncertain mercy of roads. Disguised by plain cloth and a borrowed name, he discovered the strange relief of being unrecognized. He ate in inns where no one measured his posture and listened to grievances spoken without fear. The kingdom appeared different at this distance, less obedient, more alive, and his understanding of duty shifted, though he could not yet name how. Winter gathered itself as he moved eastward, bringing a pale clarity to fields and hedges. Carriages converged on market towns where goods and gossip mingled freely, and he welcomed the noise as an antidote to thought. One morning, frost brightened the cobbles, and he stepped into a crowded marketplace alive with color despite the cold. Baskets overflowed, horses stamped, and voices rose and fell like a tide. He paused beside a stall of winter fruit, distracted by the ordinary negotiations of price and pride. Then the world narrowed. Across the press of bodies, he saw her. She stood with measured calm, gloved hands resting upon a figure unmistakably changed, her posture familiar in a way that unsettled him. For a breathless instant, he wondered whether memory had finally betrayed him. She lifted her gaze, and recognition passed between them with devastating clarity. There was no surprise in her expression, only a composed acknowledgment that carried the weight of months. The noise of the market receded, leaving the scrape of his own breath loud in his ears. He saw, with an understanding that required no explanation, what that calm concealed and what it claimed from him. He did not approach her. The restraint that had governed his life returned with cruel efficiency, binding his feet where they stood. He told himself that to speak would invite spectacle, that dignity demanded distance, yet his hands trembled at his sides. She inclined her head, a courtesy offered and accepted, and turned away, allowing the crowd to reclaim her. Memory stirred in him with unwelcome insistence, recalling the quiet mornings they once shared and the careful courtesy of her smile. He remembered how she listened more than she spoke, how her silences were never empty. Those recollections pressed against the discipline he had mastered, challenging the story he told himself about necessity. He had believed distance would simplify feeling, yet the sight of her had rendered every justification fragile. The crowd brushed past him, sleeves grazing his coat, and he felt newly exposed, as though anonymity had stripped away armor rather than supplied it. Resolve faltered, and duty trembled within him despite years of careful training and silence alone. She moved through the market with deliberate patience, conscious of every step and every glance, yet governed by neither. The child's weight anchored her to the present, a steady reminder that she was no longer solely her own concern. She sensed him before she saw him fully, a familiar gravity at her back, and chose not to turn until composure was certain. When she did, her gaze held neither reproach nor invitation. It held only truth, offered plainly, trusting him to decide what honor required now. Around her, commerce continued, indifferent, yet she felt history pause, listening, as winter light caught her breath and steadied her spine against all fear. The moment fractured his careful balance, forcing questions he had postponed to return with urgency. Could legitimacy be restored, wrongs amended, a future claimed without courting ruin? He understood the peril, yet peril no longer seemed abstract. Responsibility took shape, wearing her face and the promise she carried. As she disappeared among the stalls, he felt pursuit awaken within restraint. The laws remained unchanged, but his allegiance to them wavered, and in that wavering lay the first true movement of his heart. Choice loomed, inevitable and terrifying, demanding courage rather than compliance at last. He stood suspended between past obedience and approaching reckoning, with winter watching silently from shadows. He remained where he was, shaken by the precision of fate. The child she carried was not an abstraction but a consequence, undeniable and irrevocable. Titles and laws pressed upon his thoughts, yet beneath them stirred something older than caution. As the market resumed its indifference, he understood that silence had failed them both, and that the year he had endured had been merely a prelude. The day began with frost that gleamed like scattered diamonds across the cobblestones, and the market town stirred slowly, mist curling from chimneys and breath alike. She walked with her child bundled at her side, the soft wool pressing warmth against her own, and every step was measured, deliberate, yet unburdened by fear. Winter light caught the edges of her hair and the curve of her shoulders beneath heavy cloth, illuminating a composure that had been forged in months of quiet resolve. The stalls were lively, but she moved among them as if she belonged entirely to another world, one defined by purpose and protection rather than gossip or expectation. The Duke approached the town under the guise of a state business, though the true reason had grown undeniable and urgent. His carriage rattled over frost-hardened streets, carrying him closer to the life he had avoided for a year, each mile tightening the coil of restraint within him. He left the inns and the polite anonymity of roadside tables, seeking the inevitable collision of memory and reality. He did not wish to startle her, nor to demand explanations. Yet even at a distance, he felt the impossible pull of what had always belonged to him, and the moral and social obligations he had carried like armor now pressed upon him with a new, inescapable weight. As the morning advanced, the market swelled with ordinary activity, vendors lifting baskets of apples, the bark of a butcher blending with the clatter of horse hooves, the scent of bread warm from ovens mingling with the sharp bite of frost in the air. The crowd pressed close, yet he saw her before she saw him, the child at her side making the recognition undeniable. For a heartbeat, time slowed. The voices of the market faded, the jingle of coins and leather softened, and the world reduced to the lines of her face, the curve of her hands, the slow, deliberate motion of a mother carrying her child. She sensed him then, as though some subtle vibration of presence had passed through the air. Her gaze lifted steadily, meeting his across the press of bodies. There was no accusation, no plea, no triumph, only acknowledgement. It was a recognition that spoke of shared history, of choices made in restraint, and of consequences that could no longer be denied. In that gaze, the Duke saw both the child he had never known and the woman he had underestimated. He felt an ache that was neither regret nor desire alone, but a combination of duty, loss, and longing so potent it left him momentarily paralyzed. He did not move forward immediately. The discipline that had guided him for years, polite reserve, obedience to law and custom, the careful weighing of honor against emotion, wrestled him into stillness. Each second stretched impossibly, punctuated by the rustle of skirts, the murmur of conversation, the creak of cartwheels. To speak, he knew, might unmoor their carefully constructed worlds. Yet to remain silent risked, leaving both of them adrift in misunderstanding and separation. His hands twitched as if to reach for her, then fell to his sides. In that hesitation, he understood that courage would now be measured not in ceremony or confrontation, but in the quiet assertion of responsibility. She moved on through the market, eyes forward, each gesture infused with the grace that had become her armor. She carried the child with a strength and gentleness that spoke more of character than circumstance, and every step was an act of deliberate composure. The Duke followed at a careful distance, absorbing the rhythm of her movements, the sway of her cloak, the sound of her voice exchanged in greeting with neighbors. He observed her not as a distant husband or estranged lover, but as the living testament to a shared bond that society had tried to erase. Every word she spoke was ordinary, yet each carried the weight of her integrity and quiet triumph over circumstance. By mid-morning, the crowd thinned, leaving space for private acknowledgment without words. He fell into step beside her, neither too near to startle nor too far to remain unknown. They exchanged a nod, subtle, restrained, yet charged with recognition. It was an intimacy shaped by absence and restraint, an acknowledgment of shared history without need for immediate disclosure. Her child gurgled softly, oblivious to the tension weaving through the air, and the Duke felt a profound mixture of admiration and protectiveness. This small, ordinary life was his responsibility, and he understood that every act from this moment forward would shape its security and dignity. They reached a quiet corner, where the frost had melted into a thin sheen of water, sunlight reflecting like liquid gold. The Duke spoke, his voice low and deliberate, chosen for clarity and honesty rather than passion. "It seems, madam, that some truths cannot be hidden, no matter the distance or discretion." She listened, composed, her gaze steady and unflinching. She did not answer immediately, allowing the weight of the moment to settle around them, letting silence convey as much as speech ever could. Her reply, when it came, was measured and certain. "Time has taught me what discretion and patience can hold, and what courage it demands to face what must be faced." The Duke absorbed her words as one might receive a gift wrapped in frost, beautiful, necessary, and fraught with hidden warmth. The market around them seemed to pause in response, the vendors' calls distant, the clatter of hooves softened, as if the town itself acknowledged the gravity of this encounter. They spoke in careful turns, each sentence revealing, without excess, the reality of the year gone by. Responsibilities, obligations, the truths of lineage and duty were aired with precision, yet their language bore the intimacy of shared experience. Each pause between phrases was loaded with meaning, each glance a testament to restraint and understanding. They navigated the conversation as one might cross a frozen river, deliberately, with caution, knowing that misstep could fracture what they had yet to reclaim. The Duke's mind turned naturally toward solutions that honored both society and the life now entrusted to them. He considered letters of acknowledgment, arrangements to secure legitimacy, and the delicate diplomacy that would satisfy both neighbors and law. Yet he realized that the courage to act would not be measured in strategy alone, but in the willingness to risk reproach to claim what was rightfully his. For the first time in a year, he felt the constriction of duty loosen, replaced by purpose directed at both love and honor. As the morning waned, the crowd thinned entirely, leaving the pair and the child momentarily alone beneath the pale winter light. He watched her tuck the child's gloved hands within her own, steadying its small frame, and the intensity of responsibility crystallized. He understood that their reunion, though constrained by law and society, could be the beginning of restoration rather than merely acknowledgement. The future required deliberate action, and he felt, perhaps for the first time in months, the clarity that comes from accepting what must be faced without hesitation. She glanced toward him once more, an unspoken question lingering in the curve of her lips and the tilt of her head. The Duke stepped closer, not yet touching, but closing the space between acknowledgement and decision. The frost of winter glinted on cobbles and windows alike, capturing a moment poised between hesitation and movement, past and future, silence and confession. In that suspended breath, he realized that the year of absence had brought them not separation but preparation, and that the choice before him was no longer whether to act, but how to act with the courage that honor and love now demanded. And as the child stirred and looked toward him with innocent expectation, he understood fully the reckoning awaiting both of them, a confrontation not of anger or reproach, but of truth and responsibility, and a chance, finally, to reclaim what had always been theirs, quietly, irrevocably, and with dignity intact.